We want to update you on the Trevor Jacobs saga. You'll remember him as the former Olympic snowboarder who bailed out of a 1940 Taylor craft over the Los Padres National Forest in California, claiming that he had an engine failure. He documented the entire ordeal with cameras mounted at several different places on his airplane and filmed his bailout and parachute down and then subsequent hike to find his airplane with a selfie stick. He posted a video of the event about 30 days afterwards. The video immediately drew suspicion from the aviation community that it was all a stunt. And according to the New York Times, the FAA agreed. On April 11th, they sent Mr. Jacob a letter, an emergency order of revocation, which immediately revoked his pilot's license. According to the FAA, he violated 91.13 and operated his aircraft in a careless and reckless manner. In their letter, the FAA alleges certain aspects of the video that indicate the entire event was a stunt. For example, they mentioned that Mr. Jacob never tried to start his engine. He never looked for an emergency landing spot, even though there were multiple places he could have landed the airplane within view of the video. He never tried to contact air traffic control. He boarded his airplane with a backpack parachute, which is highly unusual. That's what the FAA alleges, and then online in more video content, other people from the aviation community saw even more suspicious activity, like he mounted a fire extinguisher to his leg, which you could see as he bailed out of the airplane. According to a video that he posted, Mr. Jacob mailed his pilot's license back into the FAA, but that may not be the end of it. If Mr. Jacob failed to report the incident in time to the NTSB, if he made false statements to the NTSB, or if he didn't preserve the wreckage so that the NTSB could conduct an investigation, the NTSB can turn that over to the Department of Justice, which would involve criminal investigation. So Mr. Jacob may still be in a lot of trouble. So to help us understand that more, I've reached out to Jared Allen, the Deputy General Counsel here at AOPA, to help us understand the legal trouble that Mr. Jacob may still find himself in. So Jared, thanks for joining us. A couple of questions here. If some of these allegations are true about, further problems, for example, isn't there a requirement to report an accident to the NTSB, and what happens if you don't?
That's correct, Richard. So as all pilots should be familiar, there are accident and serious incident reporting requirements in the NTSB's rules. Those are in 49 CFR Part 830. And those rules have to be closely examined since they do require that immediate notification be given of certain events. We often find through the legal services plan that pilots may not necessarily be familiar with these requirements. Sometimes they simply don't know that they're there. Other times they're not really certain if their particular event qualifies as something that's reportable. So in this instance, for example, the NTSB requires that an accident be immediately notified to the NTSB's operations center or the nearest regional office, but they define exactly what an accident is. And just to give you an example of how these rules may not always be clear, they generally define an accident as an event that takes place between the time people board the aircraft with intention for flight and disembark, and results in serious injuries or death or substantial damage to the aircraft. So in this case, the aircraft is clearly substantially damaged. Thankfully, there's no injuries or death. But did this event occur between the time someone boarded the aircraft with the intention of flight and they disembarked? It's an interesting question, and we'll see how the NTSB decides it.
That's it. I see the interesting angle there. Since he disembarked the airplane, does it legally count as an accident? Is that what you're saying?
It's an interesting question given the plain language of the rule. But assuming the NTSB does find that it's an accident and that these rules did require immediate notification be provided, they can certainly look at whether that notification did in fact come in. If it was an accident, there's also a requirement that a written report be filed within 10 days of the event. And all of this is laid out in the regulations.
What happens if you don't? What happens if you don't provide that notification?
Sure. So thankfully, this is not something we see too often because most pilots, once they are aware of an event and they hopefully speak to someone knowledgeable about what's going on or they're familiar with the rules, they make the reports. However, in those rare cases where the notification isn't provided, the NTSB, from our experience, will typically reach out and ask for the information. But ultimately, if it's not provided, they can pursue basically a civil penalty, generally a fine, against the operator of the aircraft, which would include the owner or even the pilots involved. And those fines can certainly add up. Now, for certain events, what's perhaps even more concerning is that the NTSB, although they can only assert a fine against an individual, they can refer the matter to the Department of Justice to investigate potential criminal penalties. So that's something that rarely happens, but it is a possibility.
Yeah. Let me ask you another. Isn't there also a stipulation that once the wreck occurs, you're not allowed to sort of manipulate that wreckage? As you may know, it's alleged that Trevor Jacob went in and moved the airplane. Is that a violation of any kind?
Well, there is an NTSB rule that specifically speaks to the need to preserve the aircraft and aircraft wreckage, assuming it's one of these types of accidents. That also includes not just the aircraft wreckage itself, but other items associated with it. So, for example, the rule specifically calls out recordings of the flight activities. So depending on what was removed here, there certainly could be additional violations that the NTSB could be looking at.
Mm-hmm. And then the final one that's alleged is that there were false and misleading statements made to federal agencies. Is there, aside from common sense, is there any kind of specific problem that could cause legally?
Well, certainly. And when it comes to those types of issues, Title 18 of the United States Code does contain a number of different criminal statutes that have in the past been alleged in certain aviation-related events. Usually these statutes have an intent element to them, meaning that the government would need to show that perhaps in some cases there was merely knowledge that the person had while they were concealing or trying to hide some piece of information. It may require that there actually be a more willful intent as part of the allegation. But just some examples, 18 U.S.C. 1001, 18 U.S.C. 1505 concerns obstruction of proceedings. So these would all be items that could be referred to, again, the Department of Justice and the U.S. attorneys to take a look at to see if there is a case that they would like to bring.
Jared, I'm thinking of a case, Forrest Kirst. In 2014, he crashed a Navion up in Alaska, and I think he spent a year in prison or was sentenced to a year in prison for making false statements to the NTSB.
Certainly. With these criminal provisions in the United States Criminal Code, they often carry not just the sanction of fines, but also incarceration. And so if a violation is established, that's typically part of a whole sentencing process and procedure, but you could be looking at years in prison, potentially, depending on the facts of the case.
Mm. So if some of those allegations turn out to be true, Trevor Jacobs still got a lot of legal trouble ahead of him, potentially, it seems like.
It may be so. It's always interesting whenever you have a case that begins with a federal administrative agency, since, as we discussed, they themselves cannot take any criminal action. They need to refer the case to the Department of Justice to investigate it. And there's a lot of steps along the way that have to be satisfied before we actually see that criminal legal action be taken. But it's always a concern and possibility in certain cases.
Mm. In egregious cases, maybe, and this certainly seems to be one. We'll keep updating you on that story to see if there's more legal trouble that Mr. Jacob finds himself in. And speaking of trouble with the FAA, this past weekend, 2 Red Bull pilots attempted to bail out of their airplanes and transfer into each other's airplanes and then fly them safely to the ground. The stunt went wrong. An aircraft was destroyed and a pilot parachuted to the ground. What's troubling about this incident is the Red Bull pilots requested permission from the FAA to do the stunt. They requested a waiver. The FAA denied their request only 2 days prior to when the pilots performed the stunt anyway. And so performing a stunt like this after you've asked permission and after it's been denied means they're likely in a lot of trouble with the FAA. Can you speak to that about, one, just the general idea of you request permission, you're denied, and you do it anyway, how the FAA is likely to look at that?
Sure. So we can anticipate that there are FAA inspectors reviewing all of the facts and evidence in this case. Certainly, as you mentioned, the fact that a exemption was specifically sought from certain FAA regulations to perform this stunt, and that the FAA reviewed that petition for exemption and then ultimately denied it, finding that their granting the exemption wasn't in the public interest and could perhaps not be done safely. It's going to be very difficult for those involved, and perhaps including the airmen, to argue that they weren't aware that this would be a regulatory violation. Just by the very nature of having sought an exemption, apparently at least someone believed that it was needed. So where we're at now, if the investigation moves forward, I would expect that the FAA investigators and inspectors will review the evidence, compile a list of potential regulatory violations. It could be a shotgun approach of many different regulatory violations. It could just be a single violation, but one they feel is so significant that it warrants a severe sanction. Ultimately, the investigatory material will end up in the hands of an FAA attorney who will review it, and they'll decide how to prosecute the case in the best interest of the FAA, which allegations should be alleged. But as part of that process, I would expect that they'll look at what they call aggravating and mitigating factors in determining what the sanction should be for any certificated airmen involved or the operators. And as we've seen in other cases, some very recently, a single act in and of itself can be severe enough to demonstrate that someone lacks the qualifications to hold any pilot certificate, resulting in a revocation. And that's typically when the FAA can establish that something demonstrates that an airman just does not have the skill, care, or judgment to hold a certificate. So it will be interesting to see what the investigation here reveals and what the ultimate outcome is, but it's clear that there are some concerns for those involved.
It seems like in the FAA's denial letter, they gave some hints as to the paths they may go down in their investigation. They were denied it because there wouldn't be a pilot at the controls, which is a requirement. And they denied it on the basis of you wouldn't be able to see and avoid traffic with two airplanes in relatively close proximity. So they kind of gave hints that that's where they were headed, and they didn't see the public interest in the stunt. So it seems like that may be some of the areas they go down.
Absolutely. And of course, in granting these types of exemptions from the regulations, the FAA is required, again, by the regulations, to make a finding on each of these points. And if they did not find it would be in the public interest or that it could not be done safely, they were required by the regulations to deny the exemption. So as we talked about, there are certainly some concerns here for those airmen involved, since the result here was unfortunately very obvious and potentially serious.
It's hard to argue with the FAA because of the end result of the stunt was exactly one of the things they were worried about. So,
yeah. Absolutely. And fortunately, it was just, well, not just, but a bent metal and a broken airplane, which can ultimately be replaced. But thankfully, there were no injuries, even if those pilots may have ultimately accepted the risk.
Yeah. Jared, thanks so much for your time. It's always insightful to talk to you, to see the angles that will come at from the legal perspective, either in defending it or from the sort of enforcement side.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard.
These stunts disappointed us. Here at AOPA, we protect the freedom to fly, to grow general aviation, to protect it and to keep it safe in just about any form, but not this. We just don't see the point, and it's disappointing to us here at AOPA.